think Tuesday's the ACT day.
Yeah, Tuesday's the ACT.
Oh, what are we doing?
October 6th.
Oh, I forgot about that.
Who else actually taking it in here?
We'll play it by ear. Who's taking the ACT? Tough day for me.
I find teaching to an empty classroom.
Huh?
You need to fill all the seats with stuffed animals.
Or like how they're doing it for the Oscars.
Kind of what I do on Wednesday. Of course, I'm staying home on Wednesday.
Oh, that's a big thing.
Can that be creepy if they talk back?
We'll bring you
Don't
cardboard
keep
cutouts.
friends.
Yeah.
Bring back what?
Cardboard cutouts.
That's,
of us.
that'd be awesome. That should be really kind of funny.
Should we make our own cardboard cutouts?
That's okay for extra credit. Okay. So went through all the things about how they got in the war, and I really want to emphasize that big deal how nothing happened in a vacuum. So the issue for the Civil Rights Act led directly to Rolling Thunder, or I'm sorry, the issue of the Civil Rights Act led to the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. And Johnson's desire for the Great Society and the Voting Rights Act would lead to denying and escalation of troops. I mean, all these domestic political things. And that was the big thing I really want to emphasize. Because, yeah, it was a foolish move, but they weren't thinking like Vietnam and then they forgot everything and thought about the Voting Rights Act. It was all these things intertwined. And sometimes it's easy to forget that. And they talk about this, they talk about these things as like compartmentalized. In fact, I just saw an example of that, and it just drives me nuts. President Wilson never talked about the Spanish flu. You remember the Spanish flu in 1918? Never talked about it. Never. And people are like, well, why didn't he talk about it? And some people use that to defend President Trump and what he's doing. Some people use it to attack him. I mean, whatever. Well, why didn't he talk about it? What was going on at that time? Right in the middle of a war, there was an Espionage Act and Sedition Act. They were literally worried about rioting in the streets. They were keeping everything quiet because of the war. Nobody wanted to admit how horrible it was because they're winning the war. I'm not saying that's the best policy, but that's why they did it. But to say President Wilson didn't talk about the Spanish flu and just implying that he didn't care. No, the war. And this wasn't any war. This was World War I. But that kind of thinking is a real problem if you just compartmentalize everything without thinking about the big picture. Of course, sometimes the big picture tends to get too big, but then we get into the conspiracies. Actually, I think that's part of the reason why conspiracy theories are so prevalent. It's kind of complex to go through everything. Isn't it easier to say there's some alien invasion or something like that? You know? It becomes much more complex. So, Westmoreland's in command. I think this is right we're equipped. Was that sound about right to you guys? Mm-hmm. And he had the strategy, what do you do? And the strategy became known as search and destroy. Search and destroy. Please say I'm recording. Oops. We're recording! And there are people watching. You lucky gods. I gotta tell you one funny thing. So I was recording on Wednesday, and I get people watching from weird places. And somebody, I have no idea who it was, responded with, boy, your class is very well behaved while you lecture. And it was Wednesday. I enjoyed that immensely. Yes. Well, that's the cardboard cutouts. Don't mess around. That was pretty fun. Okay, so search and destroy. Remember, I mentioned this before, spear and net. And the thought was if they could go out and find the enemy, find them, that would give them the opportunity to kill them. Rush them either into a trap, push them to a trap, or the trap could be in firepower. Because when you fight a guerrilla army, they will always retreat. They will pull back against a stronger force. And then ambush, sneak attack. That's what they had to do. And we'll get to a little bit why this was such a failed policy. But the plan was, and this is search and destroy, and then get this out, I didn't write it. Search and destroy is to go out, even go out into the thousands of miles of tunnels they would dig. The Viet Cong would dig once they realized with American air power. Remember arc-like light those heavy bombing missions over South Vietnam, they would go into these tunnels called tunnel routes. It's kind of hard to see. So if I get in the tunnel right there, go out into the jungle and purposely get ambushed. They wanted to get ambushed because if they stumble across the enemy out in the jungle or in a tunnel like this, then they know where they are. And then what can the American forces and the South Vietnamese forces do? Yeah, blow them away. Use heavy firepower to blow them away. They built fire support bases, these big artillery bases all over. And the whole idea was, if they go out in the jungle, someone fires, they just start shelling and attacking. The Air Force would be orbiting with planes, Army with helicopters, and they would fire. Yes?
Is there a specific group of people that would like try to run around down in the tunnels?
No, just volunteers.
Just volunteer?
Find somebody.
That's crazy.
There's always somebody who'll do it. Yeah. It's always shocking how you'll find volunteers for that. I guarantee you I would not have been one of them, and for lots of reasons. Beyond just claustrophobia, it'd be terrifying, the tunnels. But that was the plan. And you can imagine how difficult that would be on the morale of the soldiers. I mean, always on edge. Because if you're going out there to get ambushed, when are you going to be ambushed? You don't know. So you can never lay your guard down. And one of the problems with people in combat in Vietnam and wars like this, if they're never sure where the enemy is, and they never lay their guard down, their brains never shut off. That's why they called it battle fatigue still in the Vietnam War, but what would we call that today? Yeah, that's why they're so high in soldiers who go through this. Even more than soldiers who go through things like the heavy fighting in World War II, even trench warfare. Because at least in trench warfare, you know where the enemy is. So if you're in your dugout in the trenches, at least you know you're probably safe for a while and you can shut down. You never can shut down here. And that's why you're seeing so high cases of this in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's going to be really bad. It's already bad. It's going to be really bad over the next 10, 15 years. Because every year it starts getting worse and worse. And that's the basic plan. But the thought was they could use helicopters, air cavalry they called them. And they would land behind the lines, quick strike. The French didn't have this, we have this, we'll win. And that's what they thought. Therefore, they could use helicopters to drop in search and destroy missions. Or use helicopters to surprise the enemy and push them into ambushes or things like that. But the casualties were horrific. That's from 66. 2 wounded men. And that picture's a really startling one. So they're waiting to be medevaced. They've been horrifically wounded. But do you notice they're also trying to get their C rations? The rations, it's can of food. So a pretty amazing shot right there. And they use lots and lots of napalm. I love the smell of napalm as a line from in the morning from the movie called, somebody might have seen it, Apocalypse Now. It's a pretty good Vietnam War movie in a lot of ways, but it's literally like 6 hours long. And so it just doesn't quite work to show in class. I like it, but it's really long. Give me one sec. Huh. This is weird. Whoever's watching this is probably really enjoying it. This is good. So that's the basic strategy they would use. And the problem is, within the jungle, where it's difficult to fight, they would also, the thought was, okay, they have to shut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Now the Ho Chi Minh Trail, we mentioned this once before, that trail that winds down from North Vietnam into South Vietnam, and it wasn't like a road. It was a series of trails and little pathways that they would bring supplies from the north to the south. And later on in the war, it would literally be like a highway using trucks. But for much of the war, these are porters pushing their supplies on bicycles. And they would use a bamboo stake to steer it, and they just push it down the path. And they're bringing down supplies for the Viet Cong. And the United States would use every weapon they could. Heavy bombing, electronic surveillance. They dropped over 1 million of these sensors. They would drop down with the idea is if trucks rode by, they would know the enemy is nearby and bomb that area. Or also if elephants went by. And these are electronic reconnaissance planes that would go over. The U.S. would drop as many bombs, or almost as many bombs, on Cambodia and Laos during this time. And let me get my map up. On Cambodia and Laos, from 65 to 75, in Cambodia and Laos, 65 to 75, than they did in all of World War II, both Pacific and Atlantic, or Pacific and European fields. And that's just on Cambodia and Laos. That's not counting Rolling Thunder, which is over the north, and all the bombing. I mean, they bombed the hell out of South Vietnam. They bombed everywhere, looking for the Viet Cong. And the thing about it was, when the United States started sending in troops, and they start bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail, what did the North Vietnamese start doing? The North Vietnamese started sending troops down this trail too. The U.S. escalated, they escalated. The U.S. sent more, they sent more. Soon there's going to be about 130,000 North Vietnamese troops. With another 300,000 Viet Cong. Normally in a battle like this, the assumption was it's going to take 10 soldiers for the side fighting the insurgency, for every one guerrilla. Why do you need that many more? They don't know the land, and yeah, they might attack anywhere. So you got to defend everywhere. And they know where to attack, and they know the terrain. The U.S. thought we could get away with not having near 10 to 1 helicopters. Thought we could do it. Helicopters and bombing everything. But do you see a problem? You bomb everything, you start bombing civilians. And then when they went through areas, let's get to one more. Oh yeah, ranch hand. Ranch hand began in 1965. That's the dropping of Agent Orange. That's Agent Orange. I'm not going to show you the pictures of the birth effects. I can't from Agent Orange. It's horrific. Because they would drop millions of gallons of Agent Orange. Oh, by the way, it's called Agent Orange. They came in these big, massive steel barrels with an orange stripe on it. Agent Orange. It was just an herbicide. A pretty nasty herbicide. The idea was this would kill the jungle. If you kill the jungle, where can they hide? Well, yeah, it did kill a little bit, but basically just left room. But they dropped this on U.S. soldiers, South Vietnamese soldiers who happened to be there, civilians, animals. It got into the water. It caused cancer in adults. And if young women, it could, not even if they were pregnant, just young women, if they became pregnant after that, it would lead to horrific birth defects. Horrific. Thousands of people would be, we either get cancer or something to that effect because of this. The U.S. never acknowledged this until the 1980s. So all these veterans came home and were, the big thing was thyroid cancer. And they would start getting thyroid cancer. That was the first one. And the U.S. wouldn't acknowledge it. Why is that a big deal? Veterans. The United States, after World War II, during World War II, the Roosevelt administration kind of expanded the VA, so health care for veterans. but they would say, well, until you're older, we're only going to give you health care for things that came directly from your service. So they're saying that cancer wasn't from your service, which is awful. They finally acknowledged it, and they did do something about it, but still, thyroid cancer, that's pretty scary. They did the same thing after the first Gulf War in 1991. The U.S. did the exact same thing, and it's still an issue to this day. No one ever talks about it. You know what the issue was in 1991? Okay, that was the war where Iraq attacked Kuwait, and then the U.S. and a coalition drove them out of Kuwait, but of course that's Saddam Hussein in power, because it'd be crazy to try to start a civil war in Iraq. Moving on. You know what happened then? Have you ever heard of depleted uranium shells? Do you know what uranium is? Don't play with uranium. Yeah.
Well, I thought they used uranium because it wasn't really radioactive anymore and it was pretty dense.
It's still radioactive. It was depleted, so it wasn't as radioactive. And so the assumption was that when the shell is inert, it would not spew out radioactivity. And they put it in the tips of shell so it's so hard it could go through armor. Does that make sense? You know, uranium is really hard. And use that as a thing to go through armor. And they used millions of these rounds. Well, if it's in something where it catches fire, then the uranium will begin to spew, and that will form a kind of a reaction with whatever dust is out there and lead to a really dirty kind of area. Dirty uranium spill. And yes, that's what the problem is. It's relatively safe if it's in the shell. Don't touch it. But that's what happened. It got into the interview. So back to this. So ranch hand. Did it work? No. It was a dismal failure. This is the one that McNamara said, I don't remember doing this. And it's like, no, come on. You remember the victory parade from World War I and you were 2. You don't remember this? That's what we call lying. Actually, or it could be, and we have all seen people out there do it. We would never do this. If there's something like really bad, have you ever just driven it out of your mind and act like it never happened? Haven't we all done that? Kind of. That didn't happen. Move on with life. I'm happy that. Okay, so, but when you do find the enemy, what does a Viet Cong look like? So, they would have to round up, they would go on these search and destroy missions, go through villages that might or might not have the enemy, and round people up, and get intelligence. And so they would take prisoners. Young man, could be, right? They all look like potential Viet Cong guerrillas. They would go through and gather up everybody. They found lots of storage of wheat. Is it them just getting ready before the next harvest season? Or is it a storage for the Viet Cong, wheat or rice? What is it? And they would start, depends where they're at. Wheat, rice. But Johnson, back at home, okay, there he is howling with his dog. We'll come back to the Vietnam problem. They're starting to do this. Johnson is desperate, therefore, to sell the war. And Johnson is keeping everything secret from the American public. I just find that picture funny. Him in the White House howling with his dog. He was earthy. There he is. Every little kid who would come in, they'd give him a big basket full of beagles. Every kid came in, come out with 17 or 18 beagles. This picture just cracks me up. Because then we have the beagles, and then, that's not a beagle, and another dog. What was going on in the White House? Okay, so.
Obviously they were cloning them.
Cloning technology. Okay. Okay, we already showed that. But Johnson also completely agonized over this. Every day, Johnson would get the letters from people, or get letters he would sign of those who were dying. And the numbers were going up continuously. And Johnson was desperate to show we're winning the war. And it was becoming a crisis. All through 66, they sent more troops, and Johnson kept saying, war is nearly done. war is nearly done. They did these massive operations. Place here called the Iron Triangle, and along here, huge operations, massive search and destroy, no real effect. Casualties were high. Sure, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese were pushed back into the jungle, but they were clearly not winning. And the anti-war movement was beginning to grow. Criticism of, remember, when they first voted for the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, all but 2 senators voted for it. So here is mocking Johnson's Great Society as being with the soldiers, the child in absolute agony and fear. Here is military establishments, arms cost, LBJ now giving lots to the military, but health, education, and welfare doesn't have anything. Guns and butter. And guns is getting the bulk of it. And the beginnings of the anti-war protests right away. The Students for the Democratic Society, which was in your reading, they would form the first teach-ins, and this was a pretty leftist group, but they began this is at the University of Michigan, this is in 1965, when the first anti-war protest. Now, the vast majority of Americans were for the war, but there was a huge undercurrent of those against the war. And as you can imagine, and do get this down, it was focused at colleges. For obvious reason. That was the age that was being drafted. And we'll come back to the draft. But in 1967, a massive anti-war protest. Over 50,000 people marched from the White House, or from the Mall, Lincoln Memorial, to the Pentagon. And here are some of the most famous pictures of it. This is the one that McNamara talked about, where he wanted no bullets in these weapons. He didn't want anybody firing. And this is they trying to tell, why are you doing this? It's a little complex. I like putting the flowers in the rifle barrels. Here's the start of the march, this massive protest, and then going to the Pentagon, which is about 10 miles. About a 10-mile walk. And Johnson really went overnight from being very much for the war to feeling very much at siege. This is at the Pentagon, and these are people 67, and they came from Ohio State. So they have we're from Ohio. But Johnson is now gone from being winning the biggest popular vote margin in history to people waving signs saying, war criminal. And the chant in 67 was, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? And it was killing him, but at the same time, he was convinced it was a communist plot. Hey, once you convince yourself that you're right and you can't go back, it becomes easy to try to, come up with an excuse. And there were anti-war protests. And some of these would get pretty violent. So, fight communism inside the USA. I will live like one, I'm willing to die or be one. Don't trust the red murderers. And it went back and forth. You have protests and counter-protests. Nothing at all like today. And they would get quite violent. And you can imagine how the pro-war protesters could be really violent. Because by definition, they're pro-war. These would be incredibly awful confrontations. And just wait till 1970, 71. They're brutal. And so another anti-war protest. By the way, shows this picture. This is 68. What do the protesters look like? Huh? Okay, one thing, people were a lot more formal. People go to they would go to a sporting event in a three-piece suit. So don't forget, people were more formal. And that's the players. But it's just a cross-section of people, isn't it? And that's what I wanted to get to. It's kind of everybody. All different kinds of people were anti-war protesters. Now, they're going to later try to say, oh, they're a bunch of hippies and radicals. But at the same time, beginning in 64, but in 65, They would be dubbed the long, hot summers. Huge protests in urban areas of African Americans who were demanding equal rights. These equal rights laws passed, and yet they still live in abject poverty. They live in areas that don't get government services. At this time, there was housing discrimination was not only legal, it was the law. And so they had no way to get better homes. If they would try to get out, there would be a tax. It was the law. Housing discrimination was the law. It wasn't planned to be the law, but that's the way the law was interpreted. It was called redlining. And these eruptions of anger begin to take place. The National Guard would be sent out. Johnson was totally baffled. I passed all these laws. Why don't you love me? Literally. And he wanted to be loved by everybody. And it was unbelievable. Almost every one, by the way. Watts, Detroit, and New York were three of the biggest. Happened in virtually every city with a very heterogeneous population. But almost everyone was started by police violence. Police attacking or killing somebody. And a lot of people have short memories now, but they shouldn't. This has been something that's been going on since police were created, and usually targeting black men. And so when people see this today and think, oh, this is there's only radicals protesting this. Wait a second, this has been going on for about as long as literally as long as there've been police. In Newark, and this is Newark right here, police snipers actually murdered over 10 people. They just were picking off black men, one by one. Snipers on top of rooftops. This was erupting in violence. That's one. That's an 11-year-old boy killed by a police sniper. Their orders were kill any man you see. They had a curfew and just started picking people off. Once again, I got to make this very clear. People think what's happening now is unique. Not only are they mistaken, but that plays into the hands of people who try to discredit those who are against this kind of violence. This is Los Angeles, and they actually sent out the 82nd Airborne. That's how bad it was. This eruption of anger, counter-protest. All this is going on while President Johnson, from the height to trying to justify the war, for him, it would just seem to be a total disaster. Sorry, I'm trying to find the mouse. So Johnson really began to play, once again, that there was light at the end of the tunnel by 67. I know I'm going through some of these things fast, but I just want to talk about the war at 10. He kept saying, we're winning the war. By 67, we are winning the war. And how did they come up with we're winning the war? Well, what they did is, and I didn't put a slide for this. Everybody write down body counts. Body counts. In a guerrilla war like this, where the U.S. and the South Vietnamese did not have near enough troops to hold everywhere, they would go through and sweep through an area, search and destroy. What would the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese do? Often, right? But the problem is they couldn't hold. So as soon as they went through, what would happen? Sweep in right behind them. So how do you know you're winning? Yes. They just went through it. They would literally say there's a battle, and they would go through and say, okay, we killed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And they'd count the bodies. Has everyone got that? Body counts. What kind of war is this thing? You kill so many that they can't fight you.
Attrition.
Yeah, this is attrition. A form of total war. This is attrition. What does a dead person look like? Okay, we see a body, it's dead. But what if you see a blood spot on the ground? Is that a dead person? How about you see 2 lines in the dirt dragging a body away? Is that a dead person? Or is that wounded? What if an area's been hit by napalm and it's nothing but just burnt out areas? Was there anybody in there? Do you see the problem of trying to count this? Next one. What if you want a promotion? Are you going to say, yeah, it's probably not, no one's killed there? Or are you going to say 50 were killed there? Do you get the point? Body counts became exaggerated. They would go back, on the ground they'd say, we killed 7. It would go to division headquarters, we killed 70. It'd get back to Saigon, we killed 170. There's a famous story of President Johnson's press secretary getting a list of the body, or sitting next to Johnson, and Johnson's getting a list of all the people killed. This is 1967. And these numbers are just so outrageously high that Reedy sent a note, George Reedy was the press secretary, sent a note to Johnson saying, I think we've killed more Viet Cong than there were Vietnamese. How do you think Johnson reacted to this? I don't want to hear that. I want to hear we're winning. Reedy would soon resign. They'd start breaking up the cabinet. But inflated body counts. And then they would come up, write another thing down. Kill ratios. Kill ratios. Do you see what the kill ratio would be? We killed so many of them compared to what? Of us. And they come up with a ratio. And that ratio would prove we're winning. But they had no idea if any of this was true. They just kept throwing that information out there. And so Johnson going to 67 is saying, look at all we've killed. We've only lost 18,000. Only? And about 5 times that number South Vietnamese. And we've killed 300,000. Just made up numbers. But people were starting to believe we weren't winning. So Johnson went on this big PR campaign to prove we're winning. So everyone got that? Went on a big PR campaign to prove we're winning. So tomorrow, we're going to watch the Tet Offensive. Because he kept saying, we're winning, we're winning, we're winning. They're nearly out of men. 1 more month. 1 more bomb. Just a few more people. Tet! All right. And then we have, the presentations. And everyone know the presentation we do on Thursday? We know the routine.
What did the civil rights thing lead to? What was that connected to?
Which civil rights thing? Civil Rights Act, or the one we just mentioned, the law about sons?
Civil Rights Act.
So the big deal about the Civil Rights Act is now 64, and Johnson wanted the Civil Rights Act passed, so he couldn't look soft on communism, and he's running for re-election, and so he had to prove his stuff on communism that would lead directly to the Pentagon resolution.
Alright.
The Voting Rights Act would lead directly to Rolling Thunder and sending troops in 65. And it seemed to work.
Okay.
But it wasn't. Have a good day, everybody.
Thanks.
Well,
I'm hungry.
I don't know.
We gotta have a food day.
Have a good day, Mr. Partridge.
See ya.
See ya. We do.
I am done. Goodbye, everybody. Right when you find work.